Welcome to History's Mysteries, a place where the echoes of the past linger in the quiet of night. Here, forgotten worlds awaken softly, and the stories of time unfold like dreams. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let history whisper you to sleep.
The vanishing of Roanoke Colony. The salt wind cut across the sound with a sharpness that made Eleanor dare pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She stood at the edge of the settlement, watching the grey waters stretch endlessly toward England, toward home, toward a rescue that had not come. Behind her, the crude houses of Roanoke sat like broken teeth against the tree line, their timber walls already weathering to the colour of old bone in the relentless coastal air. It had been nearly 3 years since John White had sailed away, promising to return with supplies within months. 3 years of dwindling hope, of watching the horizon for sails that never appeared, of stretching provisions thinner and thinner, until the very act of survival had become their only occupation. Eleanor's daughter Virginia toddled beside her, now a sturdy child of 3, born into this strange new world with no memory of the old one. The girl bent to examine a shell, her small fingers tracing its spiraled ridges with the solemnity of a scholar. Eleanor felt her heart constrict. What future awaited this child? What had they condemned her to by bringing her here? By staying when every rational impulse screamed for them to find some way, any way, back across that merciless ocean. Ellie. The voice belonged to Ananias, her husband, emerging from the palisade gate. His face had grown leaner over the months, carved down to essential angles by hunger and worry. Mateus returned. He says we need to gather everyone. There's news. Eleanor scooped Virginia into her arms and followed Ananias back through the gate. The settlement proper was a sorry sight. 12 houses arranged around a central square, a church that had never been properly finished, and the fort itself, whose walls seemed to grow more fragile with each passing storm. The colonists were gathering near the well, their faces etched with that peculiar expression she'd come to recognize. Hope and dread in equal measure, the two emotions so intertwined they'd become indistinguishable. Mateo stood in the center of the crowd, his bearing as dignified as ever despite the obvious exhaustion in his eyes. He was CROATOAN, one of the few natives who had remained friendly to the English settlement, and over the years he had become more than just their interpreter. He was their lifeline, their only connection to understanding this land they'd so presumptuously claimed. "The CROATOAN are moving," Mateo said without preamble. His English had become flawless over his time with him, though he retained a cadence that made each word sound like it carried more weight than an Englishman's speech. "Not just one village, all of them. They're going inland, away from the coast." "Why?" Governor White's assistant, a man named Harvey, stepped forward. He'd assumed unofficial leadership in White's absence, though no one had explicitly granted him the authority. "Have they said anything about us?" Mateo's expression was grave. "They don't speak of you at all. That's what troubles me. Among my people, there are stories. When the great sickness came, before you English knew this land existed, it moved like wind through dry grass. Village after village fell silent. The CROATOAN, remember. They're moving because they fear it's coming again." A murmur rippled through the colonists. Disease was the invisible enemy, more frightening than any warrior's arrow. They'd been fortunate so far. Aside from the usual flux and fever, nothing catastrophic had struck the settlement. But fortune, Eleanor knew, was a fickle companion. "There's more," Mantia continued. "The Wepemiok to the north have stopped trading. The Roanoke will not even let messengers approach their villages. Something is wrong in this land, and you English sit here at the edge of it, waiting for a rescue that—" He stopped himself, but the unspoken words hung in the air like smoke. A rescue that will never come. That night, Eleanor lay beside Ananias in their narrow bed, listening to Virginia's soft breathing from the corner where her daughter slept on a pallet stuffed with cattail down. The darkness was complete, the kind of darkness England had forgotten, unbroken by street lamps or watchfires beyond the palisade's edge. "We should have left with the others," Ananias whispered. He meant the smaller group that had departed months ago, determined to sail north to the Chesapeake Bay, where the land was rumored to be more hospitable. No one knew if they'd made it. "We didn't have a choice," Eleanor replied, though the words felt hollow. There had been a choice, technically, but with Virginia still nursing, with the boat barely seaworthy, with the risks multiplying with every mile from the only shelter they knew, the choice had been an illusion. "Manteo's right. Your father isn't coming back." Eleanor had suspected as much for months, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that thought never could. John White, her father, the governor who'd left them here, either dead in England or trapped by circumstance, or perhaps he'd simply moved on, found excuses not to return to this failed colony at the edge of the world. "Then we need to decide what we're going to do," she said. "All of us, together." The meeting was held 3 days later in the unfinished church. All 112 remaining colonists crowded into the space, their faces illuminated by tallow candles that gave off more smoke than light. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. Harvey stood at the makeshift altar, trying to project authority he didn't quite possess. "We have 3 options as I see it. First, we stay here and continue waiting for relief from England. Second, we attempt to build vessels and sail to the Chesapeake, following the others. Third," he paused, clearly uncomfortable with what came next, "we abandon the settlement entirely and seek to join with one of the native tribes." The last suggestion provoked immediate uproar. "Leave us savages?" someone shouted. "We're Christian Englishmen." "We're starving Christian Englishmen," replied Thomas Stevens, one of the assistants, "and our children are starving. I'd rather live as a savage, as you put it, than die as a proud corpse." Arguments erupted across the church. Eleanor held Virginia close, covering the child's ears against the rising voices. She caught Manteo's eye across the room. He stood against the wall, observing with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not judgment, exactly. Perhaps pity. It was Dinas Harvey who finally restored order, slamming his hand against the altar with such force that the candles jumped. "Enough. We'll put it to a vote. But understand this. Whatever we choose together. This colony survives as one or dies as one." The debate stretched late into the night. The younger colonists, those without families, largely favoured the Chesapeake option. Movement seemed better than slow decay. The older ones, exhausted by the years of hardship, were divided between staying and seeking native protection. The families with children were the most fearful, paralyzed by the knowledge that any choice might doom their offspring. Finally, as the candles burned to stubs, a compromise emerged. They would prepare to leave Roanoke, but not yet. First, they would send scouts to make contact with the CROATOAN, Manteos people, to determine if the tribe would accept them. Simultaneously, they would begin gathering materials to carve messages indicating where they'd gone in case rescue did eventually arrive. And they would wait until spring, giving them time to prepare properly and giving Governor White one last season to fulfill his promise. Eleanor voted with the majority, though her heart wasn't in it. Delay and compromise, the English way. She wondered what the CROATOAN would think of a people who couldn't decide their own fate, even as it slipped away. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the north with unusual ferocity. The sound froze in places, something Manteo said he'd never seen before. Cold crept through every gap in the timber walls, and the colonists burned through their firewood at an alarming rate. Hunting parties returned empty-handed more often than not, the deer having moved to better forage elsewhere. It was during one of these hunting expeditions that William Withers disappeared. He'd gone out with 3 other men, tracking a deer trail through the woods. When the others returned at dusk, Withers wasn't with them. "We spread out," explained John Gibbs, his face pale, "to cover more ground. When we called for him to regroup, there was no answer. We searched until the light failed, but—" He trailed off helplessly. Search parties went out the next morning. They found Withers' musket propped against a tree, his powder horn beside it, carefully placed as if he'd set them down intentionally. But of the man himself, there was no trace. No signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away through the snow. It was as if he'd simply evaporated. The disappearance cast a pall over the settlement darker than any winter storm. People began to remember other strange occurrences, tools that went missing and reappeared in different locations, sounds in the forest that didn't match any known animal, the sensation of being watched when working outside the palisade, things that had seemed like imagination or coincidence now took on sinister significance. "My people have stories," Manteo said when Eleanor asked him about it. They were alone in the storehouse, taking inventory of the dwindling grain supplies. About the forest swallowing people, not killing them, swallowing them, taking them into itself. But these are old stories from before my grandfather's time. "Do you believe them?" Anteo was quiet for a long moment, measuring out another pound of cornmeal. "I believe that this land is older than your people understand. You see a forest and think it's just trees. You see the sound and think it's just water. But everything here has presence, awareness. Does that sound like madness to you?" "A month ago, I would have said yes," Eleanor admitted. "Now I'm not sure what I believe anymore." The winter deepened. 3 more colonists died, 2 from fever, 1 from an injury that festered despite all attempts at treatment. They buried them outside the palisade, the frozen ground requiring hours of labor to dig each grave. Eleanor noticed that they'd stopped marking the graves with crosses. It seemed pointless somehow, as if the symbols of their faith had lost meaning in this place. Virginia grew thinner despite Eleanor's best efforts. The child didn't complain. She was too young to remember anything different. But Eleanor could see her daughter's ribs pressing against her skin, could feel the delicate fragility of her bones when she picked her up. At night, Eleanor would lie awake, calculating how many more weeks they could survive on current rations, trying to decide which future was worse, slow starvation here or the risks of moving on. Spring came reluctantly, the ice breaking up with sounds like distant cannon fire. The colonists emerged from their houses pale and weak, blinking in the stronger light like creatures dragged from underground. Of the 112 who'd survived to winter, they'd lost 9 more. 103 souls remained, waiting to learn their fate. Anteo returned from CROATOAN Island in early April with cautious news. His people would accept them, but not as colonists maintaining a separate community. If the English came, they would come as supplicants, willing to adopt CROATOAN ways, to intermarry, to become part of the tribe rather than remain apart. There would be no maintaining of English identity, no clinging to their former lives. "It's assimilation," Harvey said flatly, when Monteo delivered the message to the gathered colonists. "Cultural extinction." "It's survival," countered Eleanor. She stood with Virginia on her hip, the child's weight almost nothing now. "We can preserve our stories, our knowledge, even if we change how we live." "Isn't that better than preserving nothing but our pride?" The argument that followed was the fiercest yet. Families split on the issue. Friends who'd crossed an ocean together found themselves on opposite sides. The younger generation, especially those born here or who'd arrived as children, were more willing to adapt. The older colonists saw it as a betrayal of everything they'd sacrificed to establish. In the end, no consensus emerged. Instead, the colony fractured along the very fault lines they'd tried so hard to avoid. Roughly half, led by Harvey and several of their original assistants, decided they would make for the Chesapeake after all, trusting in their English resourcefulness and God's providence. The other half, including Eleanor, Ananias, and Virginia, would go with Monteo to CROATOAN. A smaller third group, perhaps a dozen individuals, announced they would stay at Roanoke, maintaining the settlement for when rescue inevitably arrived. Eleanor looked at their faces. True believers, everyone, unable to accept that England had forgotten them. She wanted to argue, to force them to see reason. But what right did she have? Her own choice might be just as fatal. They had 2 weeks to prepare before the departure. In that time, the colonists transformed from a single reluctant community into 3 separate groups, each convinced of their own path's righteousness and skeptical of the other's chances. The carving of the messages became a solemn ritual. They had decided to leave markers indicating where each group had gone, carved into the palisade posts and the trees nearby. For those going to CROATOAN, the word was simple: CROATOAN, cut deep into the wood. For the Chesapeake group, they carved directional markers and the letters CRO, intending to complete more detailed messages along their route. The staying group insisted on carving nothing, as if any message would be an admission of defeat. Eleanor watched as Ananias worked on one of the palisade posts, his knife moving with careful precision. CROATOAN, 7 letters that represented the end of everything they'd tried to build here, and the beginning of something they couldn't quite envision. Virginia sat nearby, arranging stones in patterns only she understood, humming a tune that might have been English, or might have been something she'd heard from the CROATOAN children who sometimes visited. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Ananias asked without looking up from his work. Eleanor had stopped counting how many times they'd asked each other this question. "I think we're doing a thing," she said. "Whether it's right or wrong won't be clear until it's too late to change it." The night before the departures, the three groups held a final meal together. It was a meager affair, thin stew and hard bread, but they'd pooled their resources for this one last gesture of unity. Someone produced a fiddle and played old English tunes that made Eleanor's throat tight with longing for a country she'd left behind so many years ago. It felt like another lifetime. John Bridger, one of those staying behind, stood to speak. He was an older man, weathered by a hard life even before coming to Roanoke. "I bear no ill will to those departing," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "I understand your reasons, but I made a promise to Governor White, to the Queen, to myself, that I would hold this ground for England. Some promises can't be broken just because they become inconvenient." There was scattered applause, though Eleanor noticed it came mostly from his own group. The rest simply nodded respectfully, too tired for argument, too focused on their own anxieties about the morning. Anteo spoke next, his words measured and careful. "My people have a saying. The river doesn't care which direction you face when you drown. This land will be here long after all our decisions are forgotten. What matters is how we treat each other in the time we have. You English have strange ways, but you've also shown honor and friendship. Whatever comes next, that won't be forgotten." The meal dissolved into smaller conversations, people saying their farewells to friends they might never see again. Children who'd played together every day of their lives cried and clung to each other, not understanding why they had to separate. Parents made promises to meet again that everyone knew were lies told from kindness rather than conviction. Eleanor found herself face to face with Margaret Lawrence, who'd been her closest friend since the voyage over. Margaret's family had chosen the Chesapeake route, believing the rumours of better land and the possibility of encountering other English settlements to the north. "Tell me we'll see each other again," Margaret said, gripping Eleanor's hands with surprising strength. Eleanor wanted to lie, to offer comfort, but found she couldn't. "Tell me you'll survive," she said instead. "Tell me your children will grow old and have children of their own, and that someday, somehow, our grandchildren might meet and share the story of us." They held each other for a long moment, two women who'd crossed an ocean together, born children in a wilderness, and watched dreams crumble like sand. When they separated, both were crying, but neither apologized for it. The departures began at first light. The Chesapeake group left first, 47 people loading their possessions onto rough carts and hoisting packs onto their backs. They'd managed to construct 2 small boats from salvaged timber, barely seaworthy but sufficient for coastal travel. Their plan was to move north along the barrier islands, then inland when they found the right passage. Eleanor stood with the others watching them go, trying to memorize faces that were already beginning to fade into the morning mist. Harvey led the column, his back straight with determination or stubborn pride. It was hard to tell which. The children looked back over their shoulders, waving until their parents urged them forward. By noon, the Chesapeake group had vanished into the forest, and it was time for the CROATOAN party to depart. 43 colonists remained with Manteo, including Eleanor's family. They traveled lighter than the others, having been advised by Manteo to leave behind most of their English possessions. "You can't live between 2 worlds," he'd told them. "The weight will drown you." Still, Eleanor had secreted away a few treasures. Her mother's ring, a small Bible, a lock of hair from Virginia's first cutting. Things to remember who they'd been, even as they became someone new. The journey to CROATOAN Island took 3 days. They moved south along the barrier islands, through maritime forests of twisted live oaks, and across tidal marshes that sucked at their boots. Monteo led them confidently, knowing every trail and shortcut, pointing out edible plants and warning them away from dangerous animals. On the second night, they camped on a beach with the Atlantic rolling endlessly before them. Virginia fell asleep in Eleanor's arms almost immediately, exhausted by the day's travel. Eleanor sat with Ananias, watching the waves catch the moonlight. "I keep thinking about the ones who stayed," Ananias said. 13 people in that empty settlement, waiting for a rescue that's never coming. What will they do when winter comes again? Eleanor had been trying not to think about it, but the image haunted her. Bridger and the others growing thinner and more desperate, watching the horizon with fading hope, until one by one they succumbed to hunger or disease or simple despair. She wondered if they'd maintain the settlement to the end, or if eventually they'd abandon it too, scattering into the forest to die alone. "Maybe rescue will come," she said, but the words were ash in her mouth. They reached CROATOAN Island on the afternoon of the 3rd day, crossing the Sound in canoes provided by Monteo's people. The CROATOAN village was larger than Eleanor had expected. Perhaps 60 structures arranged around a central plaza with cultivated fields spreading inland. Children ran along the shore to greet them, shouting in their own language, while adults emerged from houses to observe the new arrivals with cautious curiosity. Monteo's mother, a woman named Akayan, stepped forward to welcome them. She was perhaps 60 years old, her face mapped with lines that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. She spoke in CROATOAN, with Monteo translating, though Eleanor suspected the old woman understood more English than she let on. "You come to us with empty hands and full hearts," Akayan said through her son. "This is good. Those who come grasping cannot receive. We will teach you our ways, and perhaps you will teach us some of yours, and together we will see what grows from this planting." The integration was not easy. The colonists were assigned to different families within the tribe, dispersed throughout the village rather than kept together. Eleanor's family was placed with Monteo's extended household, which included his mother, 2 sisters, their husbands, and a small constellation of children whose exact relationships to each other Eleanor couldn't quite follow. The first challenge was language. Virginia, with the plasticity of childhood, picked up CROATOAN words almost immediately, chattering with the other children in an increasingly hybrid tongue. Eleanor and Ananias struggled more, their adult minds resistant to new patterns. Monteo was patient, but he made it clear that learning CROATOAN wasn't optional. "You can't belong to a people whose words you don't speak," he told them. The second challenge was work. The English concept of labour was different from the CROATOAN way. The colonists were used to divisions between men's work and women's work, with strict hierarchies and expectations. The CROATOAN had their own divisions, but they were more fluid, and the work itself was constant, attuned to the seasons and the land in ways the English had never managed. Eleanor learned to cultivate the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, planted together in a symbiotic arrangement. She learned to weave baskets from river cane and identify dozens of plants by their uses: food, medicine, tool making, spiritual practice. Her hands, already calloused from years at Roanoke, developed new toughnesses, new capabilities. Ananias learned to fish with weirs and traps, to hunt with bow rather than musket when powder grew too precious to waste. He learned to read the weather in ways that made English predictions seem like children's guessing games. He learned patience. The native hunters could sit motionless for hours, becoming part of the landscape, while Ananias fidgeted and scared away game. Virginia simply learned to be a child of two worlds, or perhaps of no particular world at all. She played with the CROATOAN children, invented hybrid games that combined English and native elements, and seemed utterly untroubled by the transformation overtaking her family. Sometimes Eleanor would watch her daughter and realize she could no longer distinguish what was English about the child and what was something new entirely. Months passed. Summer came with its oppressive heat and violent thunderstorms. The colonists worked alongside their CROATOAN hosts, attending festivals they didn't fully understand, participating in rituals that made some of them uncomfortable, but which they endured out of gratitude and necessity. Some adapted well, others struggled with every aspect of their new lives. Thomas Archard, one of the younger colonists, married a CROATOAN woman named Liara in a ceremony that blended English and native customs. It was a strange affair. Eleanor couldn't help but think of it that way, with Christian prayers mixing with CROATOAN songs, English vows spoken alongside promises Eleanor only partially understood. But when she looked at the couple's faces, she saw genuine affection, perhaps even love, and something in her heart eased slightly. Others were less successful. Robert Wilkinson, an older colonist who'd been a landowner in England, never reconciled himself to his reduced status. He complained constantly about the lack of privacy, the savage customs, the degradation of English people living like natives. In September, he simply disappeared. Search parties found no trace of him, and the general assumption was that he'd tried to return to Roanoke and gotten lost in the marshes. No one spoke of him after that. Eleanor noticed she thought less and less about the life she'd left behind. The daily demands of survival pushed aside nostalgia for England, for civilization, for all the things she'd once considered essential. She still missed her father, though the missing had transformed into something harder and more bitter. Not grief, but a kind of exhausted resentment at being abandoned. One evening in early autumn, as Eleanor was helping to prepare a feast for the harvest celebration, a Cayenne sat beside her. The old woman's English had mysteriously improved over the months, or perhaps she'd simply decided it was time to stop pretending ignorance. "You are sad," a Cayenne said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor considered denying it, but found she lacked the energy. "I'm mourning," she said. "Mourning the life I thought I would have, the person I thought I was." Cayenne nodded slowly. "This is wise. You cannot become new without letting the old self die. But you mourn too long, I think. The dead do not need so much attention. The living need you more." She gestured toward Virginia, who was helping the other children gather firewood, laughing at some joke Eleanor couldn't hear. The child was brown from the sun, wearing a simple shift that was more CROATOAN than English, her hair loose rather than properly bound. She looked happy, she looked healthy, she looked nothing like an English girl. "Is she still mine?" Eleanor asked softly. "Or have I lost her too?" A Cayenne's response was unexpectedly sharp. She was never yours. Children belong to themselves, to the future. You are only the vessel that brought her here. Now, this land claims her, and you must decide if you will let her go or try to hold her back and damage you both." The words stung, but Eleanor recognized the truth in them. She'd been clinging to Virginia as a reminder of who they used to be, using her daughter as an anchor to a past that no longer existed. It wasn't fair to the child, who had her own life, to live in this strange new world. Winter came again, but this time Eleanor's family was prepared. The CROATOAN houses were better insulated than the English structures had been, and the tribe's stores were carefully managed to last through lean months. There was hunger. There was always hunger in winter, but not the desperate, gnawing starvation that had characterized their final season at Roanoke. Snow fell on a February morning, unusual for the coast, but not unheard of. Virginia ran outside to play in it, her delighted shouts mixing with those of the CROATOAN children. Eleanor watched from the doorway, wrapped in a deerskin cloak that Achayan had given her. Manteo approached, his breath misting in the cold air. "I'm going to Roanoke," he said without preamble, "to see what's become of those who stayed. I thought you might want to come." Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. She'd spent months learning not to look back, training herself to accept the present rather than mourn the past. But curiosity and something else, responsibility, perhaps, or guilt, made her nod. "When do we leave?" They set out the next morning with 3 other CROATOAN men, traveling in a large canoe across the Sound. The water was grey and choppy, winter cold and hostile. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the northern shore, watching Roanoke Island emerge from the mist like a ghost of itself. The settlement was visible from the water, or rather, its absence was visible. The palisade stood intact, but something about it looked wrong. As they drew closer, Eleanor realized what she was seeing: emptiness. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No sounds of human activity carried across the water. The place had the peculiar silence of abandonment, of life interrupted and never resumed. They beached the canoe and approached cautiously, though Eleanor couldn't have said what danger they expected. The gate stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze, with a rhythmic creak that was the only sound besides the wind and water. Inside the palisade, the settlement looked almost deliberately arranged. The houses still stood, their doors closed. Tools were stacked neatly beside workshops. The well had been carefully covered. It looked less like a place abandoned in panic, and more like a place whose inhabitants had simply decided to step away for a moment and never returned. "Where are they?" Eleanor whispered, though she didn't know why she was whispering. Anteo shook his head slowly, examining the ground. No signs of struggle, no bodies, no indication of where they went. He moved to one of the palisade posts where Ananias had carved CROATOAN months before. The carving was still there, but now someone had scratched additional marks beneath it. Eleanor couldn't tell if they were letters or simple tallies. They searched the entire settlement. In one house, they found a table set for a meal that had never been eaten, the food long since rotted to dust. In another, Eleanor discovered a child's doll sitting on a neatly made bed, as if waiting for someone to return and claim it. The church held a single candle burned down to a puddle of wax on the altar. The storehouse provided the only clear evidence of intentional departure. It had been completely emptied, every last sack of grain and barrel of salt removed. That, at least, suggested planning. conscious choice. But where had they gone, and why had they left no message beyond the original carvings? Outside the settlement, they found the graves they dug the previous winter. Someone had tended them recently. The mounds were neat, marked with crosses that showed no weathering. That meant at least some of the 13 had survived into the new year. But when had they left, and why? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Mateo declared it was time to leave. "There's nothing more to learn here," he said. "The past has swallowed them, just as it's swallowing this place." Eleanor took one last look at the settlement. Despite everything, despite having left it willingly, she felt a profound sadness at seeing it abandoned. This had been their dream once. A New England, a fresh start, a chance to build something lasting. Now it was just empty buildings slowly decaying, a monument to futile ambition. On the journey back to CROATOAN, Eleanor found herself thinking about the different paths her people had taken. The Chesapeake group might have found their better land, or they might have perished in the wilderness. The ones who'd stayed at Roanoke had apparently survived long enough to depart with some planning, but their ultimate fate remained unknown. And her own group, the ones who'd chosen assimilation, well, they were alive, but were they still English? Did that even matter? Years passed, measured not in calendars, but in seasons, in plantings and harvests, in storms weathered and children born. Virginia grew into a young woman who could speak Croatoan more fluently than English, who knew the names of plants her mother had never heard of, who moved through the world with a confidence Eleanor had never possessed at that age. She eventually married a man who was himself the child of mixed heritage, his father English from some earlier contact, his mother Hatteras. Their children would be something new entirely, carrying pieces of multiple worlds in their veins. Ananias adapted too, though more slowly. He kept his English name, but took a Croatoan one as well, as did all the colonists who stayed. He learned to find satisfaction in the seasonal rhythms of native life, in the collective nature of tribal existence. Sometimes Eleanor would catch him staring out across the sound toward where Roanoke lay, and she knew he was remembering who they'd been. But those moments grew rarer as time passed. Eleanor herself became someone she wouldn't have recognized at 20. She learned healing from Achaean and other tribal women, became skilled at setting bones and brewing medicines. She taught reading and writing to those Croatoan who wanted to learn, creating a hybrid literacy that used English letters to record native words and stories. She helped negotiate when other English ships occasionally appeared, though these grew less frequent over the years as England's attention turned elsewhere. The other colonists similarly transformed. Some, like Thomas Archard, fully embraced their new identities and became indistinguishable from those born Croatoan. Others maintained more visible English elements, speech patterns, certain customs, small rituals practiced in private. But all of them changed, because change was the price of survival. One spring morning, perhaps 7 or 8 years after they'd left Roanoke, Eleanor was working in the fields when a runner arrived from the north with news. A group of strange people had been spotted in Chesapeake territory. Perhaps a dozen individuals, speaking broken English and Algonquian, claiming to be remnants of the Roanoke Colony. Eleanor's heart lurched. The Chesapeake group? The ones who'd stayed at Roanoke? Or perhaps someone else entirely? Manteo organized an expedition immediately. Eleanor insisted on joining, despite the journey's difficulty. They traveled north for days, moving through territories that required careful negotiation to pass safely. When they finally reached the Chesapeake village, where the strangers had been taken in, Eleanor barely recognized them as English at all. There were 11 of them, 4 adults and 7 children. They wore native clothing, spoke a jumbled mixture of languages, and carried themselves with the wary exhaustion of people who'd endured more than human beings should have to bear. The leader, a woman named Alice Chapman, who Eleanor vaguely remembered from Roanoke, stared at her visitors with something between hope and fear. "We're from the CROATOAN group," Eleanor explained in English, the words feeling strange in her mouth after so long. "We've been living with Manteo's people. Are you from Chesapeake? From Roanoke?" Alice's laugh was bitter. "Both. Neither. We made it to the Chesapeake Bay, found the land just as unforgiving as Roanoke had been. Half our group died the first winter. The survivors split up. Some went further north, searching for Jamestown, though that was foolish, given the settlement hadn't been established yet when we left England." She paused, her expression distant. "I don't know what happened to them. The rest of us ended up here, accepted by these people out of pity, I think." "And the ones who stayed at Roanoke?" Eleanor had to ask. "Did you have any contact with them?" Alice shook her head. "We sent messengers back once, maybe 2 years after we'd left. The settlement was empty. We found the carvings, CROATOAN, and assumed everyone had gone to you. You're telling me some stayed." Eleanor explained about the 13 who'd remained, but returning to find the settlement abandoned with no clear indication of where its inhabitants had gone. Alice listened with an expression of profound weariness, as if the mystery was just one more weight added to an already unbearable load. "We're all ghosts," Alice said finally. "All of us who came here. The colony vanished, and we vanished with it. England's forgotten us. Maybe they tell stories about the lost colonists, but they've moved on. We're just footnotes to someone else's history." The words settled over the group like ash. Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist that they mattered, that their struggles and survival meant something, but she couldn't find the words, because Alice was right. They were ghosts. They'd ceased to be English the moment their rescue failed to arrive, but they couldn't quite become fully native either. They existed in the space between, belonging nowhere, completely. That night, the 2 groups shared a meal and stories. The Chesapeake survivors had their own tales of loss and transformation, of colonists who'd married into tribes, or wandered off into the wilderness, or simply given up and died. They spoke of children who'd forgotten English entirely, of adults who'd changed their names, of the gradual erasure of everything they'd tried to bring to this new world. Eleanor told them about life on CROATOAN, about the integration and adaptation, about Virginia's children who would be the first truly American generation. Not English, not simply native, but something synthesized from both. She tried to make it sound hopeful, like a new beginning rather than an ending, but she wasn't sure she succeeded. "Will you come back with us?" Eleanor asked Alice. "Join us on CROATOAN? There's room, and Manteo's people are generous." Alice considered it for a long moment before shaking her head. "We've settled here, made promises, formed connections. Moving again." She trailed off, but Eleanor understood. They were too tired for another transformation, another adaptation. Better to stay with the familiar, even if that familiar was itself strange. The expedition returned to CROATOAN carrying the knowledge that some of their former companions had survived, however precariously. It should have felt like a victory, but instead Eleanor felt only a deep melancholy. The colony hadn't just vanished, it had fractured into a dozen pieces, each going its own way, each becoming something unrecognizable. There would be no reunion, no restoration of what had been lost. There was only forward, into an uncertain future that looked nothing like the dreams that had brought them across the ocean. Eleanor lived another 20 years on CROATOAN, long enough to see her grandchildren, and even one great-grandchild. She taught them all the English she could, told them stories of a country across the ocean that existed more in memory than reality. But she also learned to let them go, to accept that they would be what this land made them, rather than what she'd tried to preserve. In her final years, she would sometimes walk to the shore and look north toward where Roanoke lay. She'd think about the 13 who'd stayed, about their ultimate fate, about whether they'd found whatever they were looking for, or simply wandered into the wilderness and disappeared. She'd think about the Chesapeake group and all its splinters, scattered across the coast like seeds that might or might not take root. She'd think about her own people on CROATOAN, who'd survived by surrendering who they'd been. The mystery of the vanished colony would, she knew, outlive her. People would wonder what happened to those lost English settlers, would speculate about their fate, perhaps send expeditions to search for answers. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than any mystery. They hadn't vanished. They'd transformed. They'd made the impossible choices that survival demanded, and in doing so had become something new. Something that couldn't be easily categorized or explained. On a warm autumn evening, Eleanor sat with Virginia and watched the sun set over the sound. The light turned the water molten gold, beautiful and indifferent. Virginia's children played nearby, their laughter a blend of English words and CROATOAN phrases, their games hybrid inventions that belonged to no particular tradition. "Do you regret it?" Virginia asked. "Coming here? Staying?" Eleanor thought about the question carefully. Did she regret the loss? Yes. The suffering? Certainly. The transformation that had erased so much of who they'd been? In some deep, irreducible way? Yes. But regret implied she would have chosen differently. And she wasn't sure that was true. "I regret that we had to make the choice at all," she said, finally. "But given the choice we faced, I think we did the best we could. We survived. We adapted. We're still here, even if here isn't where we thought we'd be." Virginia nodded, accepting the answer for what it was. Not reassurance or justification, just truth. They sat together in companionable silence as the light faded and the first stars emerged. Two women spanning generations, belonging imperfectly to multiple worlds, carrying forward a story that would never be fully told because its ending was still being written in the lives of children who barely remembered that it had begun on a distant shore with ships and promises and doomed ambitions. The colony of Roanoke vanished, yes, but its people didn't disappear. They dissolved into the landscape, into other cultures, into hybrid identities that confounded the categories their English patrons would have recognized. They became the land's secret, absorbed into its vast indifference, remembered only in carvings on trees and the faint traces of foreign blood running through tribal lines. And perhaps that was the truest form of colonization after all. Not conquest, but surrender. Not triumph, but transformation. Not the changing of the new world, but the changing of those who'd hoped to change it. What really happened to JFK? The secrets hidden for 60 years. The sun hung warm and bright over Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, as though unaware that history was preparing to fracture. The presidential motorcade glided through the streets, waving crowds, leaning over barricades, the air shimmering with the excitement that followed President John F. Kennedy wherever he traveled. His open-top limousine reflected sunlight like a promise, a sense that the country stood on the edge of a new, confident era. The cheering was so loud that most would later recall it as a kind of continuous roar. Until it wasn't. At 12:30 p.m., the world broke. 3 sharp cracks cut through the noise, dissonant and metallic. Some thought they were firecrackers. Others thought they were motorcycle backfires. But the way the president's body lurched, the way Jacqueline Kennedy reached toward him in a movement both desperate and confused, made the truth impossible to deny. The limousine accelerated. Governor Connolly slumped in agony, and within minutes they were racing toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. The president would not leave it alive. The shock that spread through the country was immediate and paralyzing. People gathered around televisions and radios, their faces pale with disbelief. When Walter Cronkite removed his glasses and announced that Kennedy had died, a silence fell across the nation, a silence steeped not just in grief, but in a dawning sense that something colossal and incomprehensible had unfolded in Dallas. Within an hour, a name had surfaced. Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union and returned to the United States with a Russian wife. Police said he had fired the shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. The story came quickly, cleanly, almost too neatly for some observers. Oswald himself famously insisted, "I'm just a patsy." He claimed he had been arrested not for murder, but for something larger, something he could not explain, before he was gunned down 2 days later in the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Those 2 bullets, the ones that killed Kennedy and the one that killed Oswald, created a vacuum. Into that vacuum poured speculation, suspicion, and the uneasy feeling that the truth had splintered into pieces scattered across agencies, rivalries, and darkened rooms. The Warren Commission, assembled quickly in the aftermath, concluded in 1964 that Oswald acted alone. A single gunman, a single rifle. 3 shots. One man capable of altering the world's course. Yet almost immediately, reports, testimonies, and photographs raised questions. Witnesses said they heard shots from the grassy knoll. Doctors at Parkland described a wound in Kennedy's throat that looked like an entrance wound, not an exit. Records were sealed. Autopsy materials vanished or were replaced. Intelligence agencies were evasive, offering half answers and contradictory statements. It was as if the story had been stitched together and someone had pulled at the thread. As the decades passed, small leaks and partial disclosures kept the mystery alive. The Church Committee in the 1970s revealed wrongdoing in the CIA and FBI, unauthorized surveillance, plots to assassinate foreign leaders, and programs so secret that even their existence had been denied under oath. The committee's findings didn't prove a conspiracy in Dallas, but they indicated a pattern. A government willing to conceal, manipulate, and obscure. In 1992, Congress passed the JFK Records Collection Act, promising that by October 2017, all remaining assassination-related documents would be made public. The country waited, Historians waited. Families waited. But when the deadline arrived, thousands of files were withheld again, this time under the justification of national security. The secrecy didn't silence speculation, it amplified it. What, people wondered, could still be so dangerous more than 50 years later? Meanwhile, researchers combed through the files that were released. Memos about Oswald's trips to Mexico City, surveillance reports on pro- and anti-Castro groups, warnings about threats to the president in Miami and Chicago, and details about individuals with intelligence ties who just happened to be in Dallas that day. Patterns emerged, strange coincidences, names that overlapped, but still, nothing definitive. The assassination became less a single event and more a landscape. A maze with shadows that shifted depending on where one stood. The official narrative remained, but so did the unanswered questions, the inconsistencies, the sudden deaths of witnesses, the missing records. As the country moved into the 2020s, calls for transparency intensified. Families of officials, historians, journalists, and even former intelligence officers urged the government to finally release the complete record. They argued that the last living individuals involved, though directly or indirectly, were now elderly or deceased. The Cold War was long over. Public deserved clarity. In 2022, another wave of documents was released, but still thousands remained classified or redacted. The National Archives cited agency objections. The CIA insisted that disclosure would compromise sources and methods that, remarkably, were still considered sensitive decades after the events. But then came the turning point. An independent panel of archivists, historians, and national security experts recommended the full release of all remaining files by mid-2025. Their argument was simple. The public interest outweighed any remaining national security concern. Pressure mounted. Requests from Congress grew. Public accountability became politically urgent. And then, quietly, steadily, the countdown to 2025 began. In the months leading up to the deadline, rumors swirled. Analysts whispered about a handful of documents, the so-called core files, that had never seen daylight. They were believed to include late 1963 communications between the CIA, FBI, and military intelligence units, intercepts from Mexico City, and a memo written shortly after Oswald's death that reportedly referenced something called the Contingency Monitoring Program. What this program was, no one knew, but its existence alone suggested a layer of observation or planning that had never been acknowledged. The president at the time signaled his intention to honor the deadline. It was a moment decades in the making. Archivists began preparing documents for release, scanning, reviewing, cataloguing. Agencies reluctantly cooperated, facing mounting pressure from Congress. By early 2025, the anticipation was palpable. Not because people expected a dramatic smoking gun, most experts doubted such a document existed, but because the mosaic was finally nearing completion. Thousands of pieces, scattered for more than 60 years, were about to be placed on the table at once. The truth, whatever it was, had been waiting beneath decades of secrecy, speculation, and conflicting narratives, and the world was finally ready to see it. The final releases of 2025 were more than just documents. They were the last breaths of a moment frozen in national memory. And as researchers sifted through the enormous archive, another layer of the narrative emerged. Not one of villainy, but of unintended tragedy woven through bureaucracy, caution, and Cold War paranoia. Every page seemed to echo the same message. The assassination was not just an event, but a collision of forces, each acting independently, each leaving a trail of confusion in its wake. Among the newly unsealed files were extensive interagency debates from the weeks following the assassination. The tone of these internal memos was frantic. Officials from the FBI, CIA, and military intelligence argued over how much to disclose, not only to investigators, but to each other. The fear of war with the Soviet Union, a fear that had defined nearly every political decision of the early 1960s, permeated every sentence. Leaders worried that if the public believed Kennedy had been killed by someone linked to Moscow or Havana, the calls for retaliation would be overwhelming. One memo written by a mid-level intelligence officer in late November 1963 revealed a haunting truth. Some officials believed that acknowledging their own pre-assassination awareness of Oswald's movements could be seen as gross negligence. They feared it would destroy public trust in national security institutions. And so, they lobbied to narrow the story, not to hide a conspiracy, but to hide their own failures. The 2025 declassification showed that these competing motivations led to fragmented communication. The Warren Commission received summaries instead of original files. Agencies withheld documents from each other, not out of malice, but because each believed the other could misinterpret or misuse sensitive intelligence. In some cases, officers simply feared political consequences. The truth was fractured before investigators ever arrived in Dallas. Perhaps the most surprising revelation in the 2025 files was the extent to which foreign intelligence agencies were monitoring events in the United States. At the time, newly unsealed diplomatic cables from the Soviet Union, Mexico, and several European nations showed that foreign governments were also scrambling to understand Oswald's motives. Soviet messages revealed deep alarm after the assassination. One cable, written within hours of the president's death, warned that if the United States believed Moscow had played any role, World War III could erupt within days. Soviet leaders issued urgent orders to purge any references to Oswald in their own intelligence files, fearing even innocent records could be misinterpreted. The result was an international chain reaction of secrecy. Nations were hiding details from each other, not to protect guilt, but to avoid catastrophic misunderstanding. The global landscape was so tense that even factual clarity carried risk. Yet the most poignant part of the 2025 release was not the political memos or interagency disputes. It was the personal reflections. Hidden for decades in classified archives were handwritten notes, private letters, and diary entries from investigators, military officers, and even White House staffers. Their words painted a picture of a government in mourning, confused, overwhelmed, and terrified of making the wrong move. One letter from a Secret Service agent assigned to the Dallas motorcade described the sleepless nights that followed. He wrote that he replayed the event in his mind every day, wondering what he could have changed. The route, the speed of the limousine, the position of officers on the running boards. His letter was never meant for the public. It was addressed to no one, found decades later in an archive box simply labeled Personal Correspondence, Restricted. Another set of documents showed the frantic internal debate over Kennedy's autopsy. Newly declassified medical reports revealed the pressure military pathologists faced as they attempted to reconcile contradictory wounds while keeping certain national security concerns in mind. Their notes showed uncertainty, not deceit. They were doctors caught in the middle of a security crisis. They had not been trained to navigate their early drafts, filled with crossed-out minds and rewritten observations, painted a picture of professionals under extraordinary pressure, working without complete information, their every decision scrutinized by higher authorities. As the public absorbed these details in 2025, the narrative of the assassination began to shift. The picture that emerged was neither the clean lone gunman story, nor the grand conspiracy many had imagined. Instead, it was a mosaic of human limitations. Fragmented intelligence, geopolitical fear, institutional caution, and a chain of events that spiraled faster than any agency could control. The newly released files also shed light on the infamous Mexico City episode, long considered one of the murkiest elements of the case. The 2025 documents confirmed a long-suspected truth. Intelligence agencies never fully understood who the Oswald was, who appeared in surveillance photos from the Cuban and Soviet consulates. The files indicated that several officers privately believed the photographed man was not Lee Harvey Oswald at all, but an unidentified individual who resembled him. Why this person visited those consulates, why they used Oswald's name, and whether the real Oswald ever interacted with him, none of these questions were definitively answered, but the documents made one fact clear. Confusion in Mexico City led to misjudgments in Washington. Intelligence officers downplayed the inconsistencies after the assassination, hoping to avoid accusations of incompetence. Their efforts to simplify the narrative contributed to decades of confusion. A separate batch of files revealed extensive surveillance of Cuban exile groups operating within the United States. These groups, deeply opposed to Fidel Castro, were involved in numerous plots, some sanctioned by US intelligence, others rogue operations. In the weeks before Dallas, several members of these groups were traveling through Texas, including one individual whose newly revealed FBI file noted that he had been near Dealey Plaza in early November 1963. The 2025 files did not link him to the assassination, but they confirmed that multiple politically volatile figures were moving through Dallas at the same time, complicating the intelligence picture and fueling later speculation. Still, nothing in the 2025 files suggested that these individuals acted together or that they orchestrated Kennedy's death. Instead, the documents painted a portrait of a region filled with political tension, where many unrelated actors were operating simultaneously under the shadow of Cold War anxieties. One of the most powerful revelations from the 2025 release was the extent of internal disagreement within the CIA. Newly unsealed transcripts from closed-door discussions showed that some officers believed from the start that Oswald's background made him a potential threat. He was unpredictable, frustrated, and searching for identity. Others saw him as insignificant, a man whose political interests were inconsistent and poorly formed. These conflicting assessments were never reconciled, and no single office took full responsibility for monitoring him. The siloed structure of intelligence agencies meant the pieces of the puzzle remained scattered. One unit knew he had defected to the Soviet Union, another knew he had returned, another tracked his involvement in pro-Castro activities, and another recorded his visit to embassies in Mexico City. No one had the full picture. 2025 files revealed the chilling truth. Even if agencies had wanted to stop Oswald, the disjointed structure of intelligence at the time made it nearly impossible. Their systems were built for the Cold War, not for lone actors whose motives fell between political categories. Oswald was neither a Soviet agent nor a Cuban asset, neither a loyal Marine nor a stable civilian. He was, as one analyst wrote in a note discovered in the new release, a man who slipped through every crack we had. Perhaps the most unexpected documents in the release concern the days immediately after the assassination, when Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency. Newly unsealed communications revealed that Johnson privately worried that early evidence pointed toward foreign involvement. He feared that if the public interpreted the assassination as an act of war, the nation would demand retaliation before the truth could be fully understood. His private recordings, some transcribed for the first time in 2025, showed a man deeply aware of how fragile the geopolitical balance was. His urgency to create a single, stable narrative was driven not by deceit, but by national fear. These recordings showed Johnson repeatedly urging caution, warning that any premature conclusion could escalate into conflict. Some conversations revealed that he believed the Warren Commission's primary responsibility was to reassure the public, even if that meant simplifying the darker, more complicated edges of the truth. The Commission, composed of men who themselves feared the potential consequences of their findings, leaned into that sense of duty. Not to hide a conspiracy, but to maintain stability. The documents released in 2025 also contained fragments of testimony and interviews that had never been seen outside of classified rooms. Some of these statements were withheld for decades because they contradicted or complicated the Commission's findings. One interview with a federal agent suggested that witnesses who claimed to hear shots from multiple directions may have been influenced by the chaotic acoustics of Dealey Plaza. Another suggested that early photographic analysis had been inconsistent due to unreliable equipment and rushed development procedures. The release of these files did not resolve the long-standing debates over ballistics or trajectories, but they offered clarity. Confusion, not conspiracy, shaped much of the early evidence. Perhaps the most humanizing documents in the release were the letters written by Jacqueline Kennedy in the months following the assassination, while most of her personal correspondence remained sealed for privacy. A few previously classified notes concerning security matters were made public in 2025. In them, she expressed not only grief but also frustration at the conflicting reports she received from officials. She struggled to reconcile accounts of the assassination, medical findings, and the limited information she was given. Her letters revealed a woman seeking truth amid obscured narratives, a reminder that even those closest to the tragedy were left with unanswered questions. As historians worked through the extensive release, a unified picture finally began to emerge. It was not perfect. It was not simple, but it was grounded in evidence that had been scattered and withheld for over 6 decades. The assassination was now understood not as a clear-cut case of lone action or elaborate conspiracy, but as a moment where human error, geopolitical fear, institutional pressure, and fragmented intelligence collided in a single point of failure. The truth was not hidden because it was sinister. It was hidden because it was chaotic. 2025 files showed that agencies had been overwhelmed, under-coordinated, and fearful of consequences that ranged from political embarrassment to nuclear war. They simplified because complexity was dangerous. They redacted because uncertainty looked like guilt. They hid their own contradictions because admitting them could have shattered public trust during the most dangerous era of the Cold War. Yet now, with the full release, the public could finally see the assassination as history, not myth. It remained tragic, confusing, and emotionally charged, but it was no longer obscured by silence. In the end, the declassified files of 2025 did not provide a dramatic revelation. They provided something more valuable: context. They showed that the truth of November 22nd, 1963 was not a single story, but a tapestry woven from fear, miscommunication, secrecy, and the limits of institutions caught in crisis. The shadows that had surrounded the assassination for more than 60 years were not populated by sinister figures. They were populated by ordinary people facing extraordinary pressure. As the last pages were unsealed and the final memos uploaded, the weight of history lifted slightly. The nation, at long last, could look back on the tragedy, not through the haze of speculation, but through the clearer light of understanding. And with that clarity came something long overdue: the quiet, solemn closing of a chapter that had remained open for generations. Sleep to history's mysteries. The Lost Continents. The world quiets around you as night settles in, and as your thoughts drift like distant tides against the darkened shore, we step softly into the half-remembered places of the earth. You breathe slowly, gently, letting the last traces of the day dissolve. The oceans deepen around us. The stars draw faint silver lines across the sky, and beneath that vastness lies a question as old as humanity itself. What vanished beneath the waves? What worlds were lost to time? Tonight we drift back, far back, into the silent waters of history's greatest mysteries. The lost continents, whispered in ancient texts and echoed in geological riddles, pull us into their quiet embrace. They are places that shimmer at the edge of memory, half myth, half possibility, suspended somewhere between science and dreams. They exist in that tranquil space where facts cradle legends, and where legends fall gently into the sea. Let your breathing settle into a soft rhythm. Let the mind loosen like soft sand under tide. We begin now, drifting across the surface of the world's forgotten lands. Far beneath the Atlantic Ocean, the water is still and old, colder than memory, darker than unlit caverns. Here lie the first whispers. Atlantis Plato's voice drifts through time like a quiet tide, telling of a grand island empire, rich in shining temples, wide avenues, and circular harbours carved with mathematical perfection. It was said to be larger than Libya and Asia combined, a jewel of the ancient world, until the sea claimed it in a single day and night of ruin. Imagine, for a moment, gliding silently above that deep ocean floor. The water stretches endlessly, a world without wind or wave in this nighttime calm, and somewhere far below, layered in silt and quiet darkness, may rest the faintest ghost of a world that once breathed. Stone pillars fallen like forgotten memories, pathways swallowed in shifting sand, the outlines of a city that may have lived only in story, or may have existed long before recorded time, when coastlines were younger and seas had not yet risen to swallow the world. Atlantis is the most famous of the lost continents, but it is only one dream among many. The earth has forgotten more shores than it remembers. Let your breath slow, like waves washing over worn stone. Far to the south, beyond the cold currents curling around Africa's edge, ancient sailors whispered of Lemuria, a continent stretching across the Indian Ocean, an ancestral homeland of forgotten peoples or vanished creatures. It was proposed in the days before plate tectonics, an attempt to explain mysteries of biology and migration, but its name lingered. Lemuria became a place not of science, but of imagination, lush, tropical, a cradle of early humanity, or lost civilizations whose temples now lie beneath coral and drifting sand. Some pictured it as swaying with emerald forests and rivers wide as seas. Others imagined tall white cities rising above turquoise lagoons. And in every imagining, Lemuria sank long before recorded memory, leaving only fragments in myths from India, Madagascar, Indonesia, and beyond. Now, imagine drifting above that warm sea. The moonlight rests over the water, like a thin sheet of silver. Beneath the surface, shadows shift as if remembering shorelines. Long vanished volcanic ridges curl upward like the silhouettes of broken mountains. The ocean floor drops and rises in quiet patterns, hinting at the possibility that once, long ago, something vast stood here, kissed by sun and wind. You float, weightless, letting your thoughts move slowly, gently. But let us drift farther still to the Pacific, largest, deepest expanse of water on Earth, a world unto itself, a place of silence older than civilization. Here lie legends that predate even the oldest stone carvings, the stories of Mu, long before modern theories. Mystics and Victorian explorers spoke of a continent stretching across the Pacific, home to a sophisticated ancient people who built temples and monuments across what are now small scattered islands. Perhaps Hawaii, Tahiti, Rapa Nui, Easter Island were once mountaintops of a vast land swallowed by the sea. Perhaps the colossal Moai statues are not signs of isolation, but remnants of a culture connected by land that is now gone. As you drift deeper into calm, imagine following the currents toward Rapa Nui. The waves lap gently around giant stone faces staring eternally toward the horizon behind them. Green slopes rise, and beyond them, ocean. Only ocean. Yet the Polynesian stories speak of Hiva, their ancestral home, a great island or continent destroyed in a cataclysm. And as your mind wanders softly through the night, you may picture lush valleys, stone temples, terraces crawling up mountainsides, all now buried beneath an endless Pacific blue. The idea of Mu lingers, not because it is proven, but because it resonates with something deep in the human spirit, a desire to understand where we came from and what worlds existed before us. The ocean holds so many secrets, and silence is often mistaken for absence. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the quiet flow through you like a warm tide. Across the world, ancient maps and legends speak of lands now swallowed or shifted. When Earth's crust moved and changed, when ice sheets melted and seas rose by hundreds of feet, entire landscapes vanished Sundaland. Once a sprawling extension of Southeast Asia, was a vast, fertile region during the last ice age. Rivers wound through plains where now only the South China Sea lies. Human ancestors may have walked along great valleys and settled in coastal cities, now lost to the deep. Slowly, as the glaciers melted, the sea crept forward like a silent tide, filling riverbeds, covering forests, and turning mountains into islands. Indonesia, Malaysia, Borneo, and the Philippines are fragments of a world once whole, a world now hidden beneath warm tropical waters. Imagine traveling through these Pacific shallows in the soft night. The moon reveals faint shapes beneath the waves, ridges, plateaus, perhaps the outlines of ancient river channels. In the quiet of sleep, It is easy to imagine lights glowing faintly in the deep, lanterns of forgotten villages, or fires long extinguished, but remembered by the earth. Night deepens around us. We drift westward now, toward the Mediterranean, once far lower, carved by rivers flowing through what are now deep basins. When the Atlantic poured in millions of years ago, it transformed the landscape entirely. In this place of shifting seas and rising stones, some believed in the lost land of Tartessos, an ancient Iberian kingdom of silver and bronze, of traders and storytellers, swallowed by floods or earthquakes. Others imagined the long-lost island of Lyonesse off the coast of Britain, a land of saints and monasteries, drowned in a single night. Fishermen still tell of church bells ringing from beneath the waves. Whether myth or memory, such stories cling to coastlines everywhere, reminders that the sea slowly reclaims all things. Let your breathing soften, let the weight of the past settle into a gentle whisper. Toward the far north, beneath ice and shifting tectonic plates, lies the mystery of Hyperborea, an ancient land of eternal spring in the frozen realms beyond the north wind. It appears in Greek texts as a paradise untouched by war or sorrow. Some equated it with lands that once lay ice-free during warm epochs. Others saw it as pure myth. But the Earth's climate has shifted many times, and there were ages when the Arctic was green, wrapped in forests and warm breezes. Beneath Greenland's ice sheet lies evidence of ancient vegetation, lakes, and flowing rivers. Worlds erased not by water, but by ice. When your mind rests in the darkness of night, it becomes easier to imagine that once, far above the world, there flourished a land of gentle sunlight and unending calm. And still we drift. South now, to the rim of the Pacific, where the Bering Land Bridge once connected Asia and America. A broad plain, now lost beneath frigid waters, may have supported entire cultures, scattered settlements, and the first human migrations into the New World. The wind that blows over the Bering Sea carries the faintest echo of footsteps across a land long gone. And farther still, beneath the cold waves of the North Sea, lies Doggerland, once the heart of Europe's prehistoric world. It stretched between Britain and Scandinavia, teeming with wildlife, forests, and human settlers. Then, slowly, the sea rose. A tsunami struck, and the land faded, leaving behind only fishing nets that occasionally drag up bones, tools, and fragments of a forgotten life. All across the world, the earth has erased continents, not always through sudden catastrophe, but often through slow, gentle transformation, like a tide reshaping a shoreline grain by grain. Let your thoughts drift like these grains. Let the quiet carry you. The stories of lost continents are not simply tales of destruction, but reminders of how deeply the world has changed. Shorelines are temporary mountains rise and fall. Forests become seas. Seas become deserts. Civilizations blossom and wither. The earth is ancient, far older than memory, older than legend, older than the words we use to describe time itself. You float now in a world of possibility, imagining coastlines lit by torchlight, temples glowing beneath starlit skies, entire continents alive with cultures that vanished long before anything was written in stone. You drift, calm and weightless, through the stories the ocean keeps. The sea is vast, and so are the memories hidden beneath it. And as we continue this quiet journey toward the deepest, oldest mysteries the planet has ever known, we move ever closer to the edge where myth and history begin to blur, where the ether whispers drift through the deep like soft currents, moving through time as effortlessly as the tide. And as we descend again into that vastness of quiet ocean and forgotten worlds, your breathing stays slow and gentle, like the steady rhythm of waves washing over an ancient shore. Darkness below grows thicker, but it is not a frightening darkness. It is warm, familiar, like a blanket of time settling over the earth, hiding secrets too old for writing, too large for memory. We drift deeper, letting the ancient waters guide us into places long submerged, long silent. Somewhere in that stillness, there lies an understanding that the continents beneath our feet are not fixed things. They shift, they drift, they crumble, and sometimes they vanish entirely, just as the mind sheds thoughts as it moves toward rest. So too does the earth shed landscapes, trading mountains for plains, shores for seas, land for water. Entire worlds are born, erased, and reborn again across millions of years, each one slipping quietly into the next like a dream, fading into another dream. We drift now towards Zealandia, one of the most extraordinary lost continents of all. Unlike Atlantis, Mu, or Lemuria, Zealandia is not legend but geological truth. Almost the size of Australia, it lies submerged beneath the Pacific Ocean, with only the mountain peaks visible today, as New Zealand, New Caledonia, and a few scattered islands. For millions of years, it rose and fell with tectonic breath. Then, long ago, the sea gently swept across it, leaving only fragments above water. Imagine hovering above its drowned surface. The moonlight paints a soft silver glow across the waves. Beneath them lies a vast plateau, carved by rivers that have not run for tens of millions of years. There are valleys deep enough to hold entire mountain ranges, and mountains tall enough to once have scraped the sky. But all of it now rests under the weight of the ocean, a continent hiding in plain sight, a reminder that even the land we know today can slip quietly into the sea. We breathe softly, drifting. The water grows calm around us. To the west, beneath the Bay of Bengal, lies another mystery, the rumoured lost land of Kumari Kandam. In Tamil tradition, it was said to be a cradle of ancient civilization, a great southern continent connecting India to Antarctica. Modern geology tells another story, yet the legend persists in the hearts of millions. The tale of a land once filled with poets, scholars, and sages. Like many lost worlds, it may carry memories of real ancient floods. Coastal plains drowned by rising seas after the last ice age. Villages swallowed slowly as the shoreline crept inland. Imagine walking along a prehistoric coast where families once lived, where fires once burned, where waves once washed against soil, now hundreds of feet below the modern ocean. As the water rose, inch by inch, year by year, the land receded. Stories remained. Over time, the stories became legend, and legends became the lost continent of Kumari Kandam. The earth is shaped not only by mountains and seas, but also by memory, and memory changes shape as gently as waves smoothing stone. We drift now toward the middle of the Indian Ocean, where the sea floor reveals scars, ridges, plateaus, and sunken fragments of an ancient world. Beneath the Mauritius waters lies evidence of a lost microcontinent called Mauritia, hidden beneath layers of volcanic rock and coral. Long before humans walked the earth, Mauritia split and sank beneath the waves, leaving only Madagascar, India, and tiny island chains as hints of its existence. It had no cities, no temples, no people, but its disappearance shows how easily even whole continents can vanish, leaving only geological whispers behind. Let your shoulders relax, your breath slow and deep. The world grows quieter, softer, more distant. Around us, the planet's history stretches far beyond human memory. There were times when Earth's land masses were assembled into supercontinents: Pangaea, Gondwana, Laurasia, vast sweeping realms where deserts stretched from horizon to horizon and forests ran unbroken across thousands of miles. But before these giants rose, others existed: Rodinia, Columbia, Nuna, each forming, breaking, drifting, and dissolving into oceans that have long since changed shape. Imagine watching continents move as if in slow motion. You stand on ancient stone while mountains rise like long, soft breaths the earth's seas melt away. Rivers carve new paths, valleys deepen, islands drift apart. Everything shifts so slowly that it feels motionless, yet over millions of years, entire worlds rearrange themselves. This is the Earth's quiet truth. Continents are momentary arrangements in an ocean of time. And yet, even against this immense backdrop, human stories cling tightly to vanished lands. We hear echoes of them in Polynesian chants, in Greek philosophy, in Indian epics, in Egyptian priestly tales, and in medieval legends whispered across coastlines. Many cultures speak of lands taken by the sea, sometimes in violent storms, sometimes in gentle rises that unfolded over generations. These stories may not be literal histories, but they capture something true about humanity, that people remember the sea moving, rising, swallowing land. They remember coasts that no longer exist. They remember migrations forced by tides. And over thousands of years, these memories become mythic continents, lost to all but the imagination. Let your mind drift through this tapestry of ancient memory. Let it unravel gently, like mist over a calm morning shore. The Mediterranean hides traces of Bronze Age settlements drowned by earthquakes and shifting coastlines. The Black Sea may have once been a freshwater lake until the ocean broke through, flooding entire valleys. In Japan, sunken ruins off Yonaguni resemble stepped pyramids, carved by nature, perhaps, or shaped by early humans whose world was slowly overtaken by water. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, divers found stone structures covered in coral, hinting at settlements older than recorded civilization. Everywhere the sea touches land, the sea eventually takes it back. We drift west again toward the Atlantic. Beneath the waters near the Bahamas lie the Bimini Road, rectangular stones arranged in a pattern that some believe are remnants of an ancient civilization. More likely they are natural formations, but even so, their shape invites the imagination to wander. And imagination is part of what keeps lost continents alive. As you breathe softly, the story continues to unfold like a gentle tide. The Azores rise from a deep Atlantic ridge where volcanic mountains push through the sea. Some believe these islands were once peaks of a larger landmass. Ancient maps drawn before the discovery of the Americas showed phantom islands dotting this ocean. Antillia, Brazil, High Brazil, lands that sailors insisted they saw, even if no one could ever find them again. Perhaps they were tricks of light upon the water, perhaps they were misremembered coastlines, or perhaps, long ago when sea levels were lower, these places truly existed above the waves. As night wraps its calm around your thoughts, you drift through these possibilities without needing answers. The beauty of lost continents lies not in proving them, but in wondering about them. Far to the south, Antarctica itself may guard ancient landscapes buried beneath miles of ice, mountain ranges, valleys, and maybe lakes untouched for millions of years. There were ages when this icy world was covered in forests, where warm breezes carried moisture across a land now locked in frozen silence. Beneath its glaciers may rest fossils of unknown species, traces of climates long forgotten. Antarctica was once part of Gondwana, connected to Australia, Africa, India, South America. When these continents tore apart, Antarctica moved southward, slowly freezing into its modern stillness. Imagine that slow drift, the land becoming colder and quieter, the forests withering, the final rivers freezing into silence, the continent turning to ice, carrying inside it the memory of warm, ancient worlds now completely lost. You sink deeper into calm, and from these geological secrets, we return once more to the human stories, the legends that keep the world's imagination alive. For even if Atlantis never existed as a physical place, it exists as an idea, a reminder of fragility, of knowledge lost, of civilizations that rise and fall like tides. Lemuria symbolizes migration, the mystery of origins, the yearning to understand where humanity began. Mu represents the vastness of the Pacific and the deep time woven into island cultures. Kumari Kandam reflects ancient flood memories and the shifting of coastlines over millennia. All these stories are maps, not of land, but of longing. As you drift, the world grows softer around you. Thoughts slow. Breathing settles. The continents of the earth fade into silhouettes beneath a dark ocean sky. Even if no ancient advanced civilizations existed on these lost continents, the planet is full of forgotten worlds, real landscapes that vanish beneath rising seas as the Ice Age ended. Entire regions the size of countries now lie underwater, filled with the remains of forests, plains, and possibly the footprints of people who lived close to the shifting shores. Wherever the ocean is deep, there is the possibility of what once was. Let your mind wander to the depths now, as though floating above the world in a gentle, timeless drift. The ocean is a vast library, its shelves made of stone, its pages written in layers of sediment. It keeps its stories locked beneath pressure and darkness, giving only subtle hints. A fossil lifted from the seabed, a submerged forest, a forgotten coastline revealed by sonar. The earth holds more history than we can ever uncover, and more mysteries than we can ever solve. You drift now through the last currents of the story, carried by slow, rhythmic waves. The lost continents around you fade into silhouettes, quiet and unreachable, but comforting in their mystery. They remind us that the world is not static. It is alive, constantly shifting, constantly remembering and forgetting. The ocean hums softly, its surface smooth beneath the moonlit sky. Somewhere far below, untouched for ages, lie the remnants of landscapes we will never fully map, mountains worn by time, valleys deepened by ancient rivers, shorelines erased long before the first human drew breath. The earth is ancient, and we are only passing through its memories. And as the story settles into silence, you remain weightless, calm, drifting between the known and the unknown. There is no urgency here, no need for answers, only the soft comfort of possibility, of imagining worlds hidden just beyond reach. The continents that once were, and may never be again, rest beneath the sea in eternal quiet. But in your mind they drift on, glowing faintly like lanterns carried across dark waters, guiding you toward rest. You exhale slowly. The night deepens. The waves still. The lost continents fade into peaceful darkness, and you drift gently, softly, into sleep. Earth's forgotten continents whisper softly from the depths.